Good afternoon.
5 minutes, please.
I'll be quick. I'm Steve Aleman with Disability Rights Texas. I'm here standing against this piece of legislation. In the interest of time, I'm going to just provide a couple of high-level observations and then get into some of the specifics of why we object to the legislation. At a high level, of course, we've just had conversations before you all about the tremendous needs of meeting the needs of students with disabilities across our state. We've talked about the resources that are needed. Quite frankly, our observation is that this is really a luxury that we cannot afford, given the amount of resources that we know are already documented and are should be earmarked towards meeting those needs and a really greater multiplier effect in terms of our special education system for public school students with disabilities. With regard to the legislation itself, there's a couple of troublesome pieces in here which we object to. There is a piece in here about giving private school students a head start and fast track on evaluations to perhaps enable them to get a more lucrative ESA. Now, it is true that public schools have a duty to evaluate all students, wherever they may come from. Our objection is that the legislation as drafted actually puts private school students ahead of public school students in that evaluation process in several ways. First of all, it is perhaps not advisable, but it is legal for a school district to actually say, no, we are not going to do an evaluation for you. They can then issue what we call a prior written notice, a legal document that says why we are not going to test your child for a disability right now. Under this legislation as drafted, that is actually not allowed. It says you must evaluate the private school student. So right there, you are creating a greater right to a private school student than a public school student has. Second, the trigger for conducting that evaluation is sooner in this legislation for a private school student than it is for a public school student. Finally, the timeline that it has to happen is expedited for a private school student over a public school student. In my handout for you at the very back, you'll see a color flow chart. The reason why I included that is because it's actually quite complicated about when schools have to do that full initial individual evaluation, FIIE. Well, it is true, again, that public schools have to do this for anybody. What this legislation does is actually goes around those procedures and, again, streamlines and gives a preference to private school students. That's really not acceptable to us. So that is a reason why we're against this legislation. Another reason, and we talk a lot about parent choice, of course, and being informed choice. No choice is good without it being informed. There is a, quote, special education notice in this legislation. However, that notice is really insufficient. It doesn't do enough in terms of what laws are out there to truly inform and educate a parent who might want to consider this option. Let's say, take for granted for a moment, this comes into place. We have a public school family with a child with a disability now may be considering, well, what are my options in a private setting? Without knowing all of the information, not just about what that program might offer, what it might cost, what are my legal rights? That's a critical issue for students with disabilities. What are my appeal rights? What are my rights to ensure that I do receive services? The notice that's specified right now is insufficient to cover such key laws as the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the backbone of protection for all people with disabilities in this country. Now, it is it's vital that everyone understand what are the differences between public schools and private schools with regard to the legal rights. I'm going to close with one other criticism of the bill, which is with regard to whatever would be that bonus part of the ESA award for a student with a disability. It talks about the student having to get an IEP from the school district, which, by the way, the school isn't at all compensated. The public school isn't compensated to do that. But even if you do generate that, that alone is not sufficient to decide how much that special ed allotment is going to be for that school district. it is, as we know from the conversations we've just had in this committee, special ed finance is very complicated. The way it is currently worded, it's not really possible to get an accurate estimate about what that amount would be for a particular student. You need a lot more information than what's specified in this legislation. So that's going to be a real problem with actually executing the program if you go with the way it's worded now. I'll conclude with those remarks, and I appreciate your time and attention.
All right. Thank you very much for your testimony.